I should, in fairness, add that I'm trying to be coherent. I'm a mission preacher, and I was 7 weeks in 7 different parishes during Lent. And then I was in Nashville for the Mother House for the Triduum. So I don't even know where I am at this point. So we'll do the best we can for you. I'd like to begin this conference with the first letter to the Corinthians. And it would be chapter 6, beginning, I'd say approximately at verse 27. Are you bound to a wife? Do not seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Do not seek marriage. But if you marry, you do not sin. And if a girl marries, she does not sin. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. I mean, brethren, the appointed time has grown very short. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with it, for the form of this world is passing away. Pope Benedict XVI has declared this year, 2008-2009, to be the year of St. Paul. And St. Paul, as you know, was a towering figure in the life of the Catholic Church. Peter is the first pope. Paul's the great apostle of the Gentiles. They share a common feast. The Magnificat antiphon for this feast is, Peter the apostle and Paul the teacher of the Gentiles taught us your law, O Lord. This antiphon is a particularly dear one to us because the tradition is that on the feast of St. Dominic and the feast of St. Francis, that the Franciscans and Dominicans get together, and in the old times we used to sing a variation of this antiphon, which was the seraphic Dr. Francis and the apostolic Dr. Dominic both teach us the law of God. And we'd switch it around depending on whose house we were in to put it first. Apostolicus Pater Franciscus, Paraficus Pater Franciscus, Apostolicus Pater Dominicus, ipsi nos docuerat legem tuam Domine. See, I can still remember my Latin. So, but the variation on this for our orders actually comes from this antiphon for the feast of Saints Peter and St. Paul. However, St. Paul himself in his life has often been the subject of a paradox, not only regarding himself as an apostle and a principal teacher of the Catholic faith, but also regarding points of his doctrine which can seem contradictory. After all, a paradox is defined as a statement which appears contradictory, but actually has a basis in truth. And so during the year of St. Paul, it seems especially fitting to take up this issue of the paradox. Now, I'm going to treat the paradox in 2 places, 2 planes. The first regards the problem of St. Paul as what some people think, someone who founded another church than the Church of Christ. Paul's place in the founding of the Society of the Church and the complete repudiation of St. Paul of the law of Israel is a difficulty that has faced scholars for many years. The second I want to take up has to do with the spiritual life, and it's reflected in this quotation I just read for you. But you know, there are many seeming paradoxes in St. Paul. When I am rich, when I'm poor, I am rich, etc., etc. So let me discuss the first one. People like Albert Schweitzer in The Quest for the Historical Jesus say something like this. Paul did not desire to know Christ after the flesh. Those who want to find a way from the preaching of Jesus to early Christianity are conscious of the peculiar difficulties raised. Paul shows us with what complete indifference the earthly life of Jesus was regarded by primary Christianity. Or the famous historian who was actually a fallen away Catholic, whose books I actually read when I was a teenager, Will Durant, says this: Paul created a theology of which none but the vaguest warrants can be found in the words of Christ. Through these interpretations, Paul could neglect the actual life and sayings of Jesus, which he had not directly known. He had replaced conduct with creed as the test of virtue. It was a tragic change. And then there's a modern Catholic scholar, Raymond Brown, who in The Death of the Messiah says this: regarding Paul's statement that Jesus was descended from David according to the flesh, one may ask whether the evangelists who wrote of the virgin conception would have chosen such phrasing. Paul does not quote Jesus or cite his individual deeds. And actually, I was reading a secular text that claimed, was the 100 most influential people in the history of the world. And oddly enough, St. Paul was second, but Jesus was like 35. And the reason was because St. Paul actually gave the interpretation to many things which Christ doesn't interpret for us. Christ, for example, says he has to suffer and die, but as you know, he's very unclear about the reasons. And what St. Paul does is he fleshes out the reasons using the whole tradition of Israel to do this. Now, these and many other authors question whether St. Paul actually created a new religion which completely differed from the religion of Jesus. Their authority is that Paul's experience on the road to Damascus is a spiritual one, which seemed to define his ideas about Christianity, and because of this, Paul makes little reference to the physical events in the life of Jesus. Now, I would on the outset just say that this is a rather silly idea, because, for example, as you know, St. Paul talks about the fact that the risen Lord, is experienced by many witnesses, some who have gone before us physically. In other words, he talks about the physical resurrection. And in our particular times, the issue of the physical resurrection has become very salient because, I don't know if you're aware of this, but many, even Catholic theologians, question the necessity of the physical resurrection. The head of the Australian Theological Conference, who was a priest, about 15 years ago said that if they found the body of Jesus in a tomb in Israel tomorrow, it wouldn't do anything to shake his faith in the resurrection. Because the resurrection wasn't about bodies walking around. It was the fact that the community, because they were struck by the seeming incomprehensibility of Christ's death, had to find some hope, and so they sort of created these experiences of Jesus from their faith. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, as you know, takes up this issue about whether the community created the resurrection from their faith or not, and basically says, again, this is a rather silly idea, because for one thing, they found it so hard to believe in. You remember when Jesus was even ascended into heaven, he upbraided them for their lack of faith, because even though he'd been there for 40 days, eating and drinking in their company, and inviting them to put the fingernails in the marks, they still find it hard to believe because it's such a stupendous mystery and really isn't against reason, but it's so beyond human reason for us. You can demonstrate the necessity of the resurrection, and I believe Aristotle could do this because he knew that the spirit was immortal, in my opinion, and he also knew that the body and the spirit were in a complete relationship with each other. You may remember Plato solved the difficulty of the mortality of the body by saying the body was a prison in which we were left, but it had no real relation to the soul. But Aristotle wasn't of that mind. Well, how to explain the fact that the body dies forever? There's no explanation by philosophy or reason. It's a blank wall to which we're joined. And when Christ rises from the dead, like a ring to a figure, we see this solution. But anyway, to claim that because Paul's primary experience of Jesus was this experience on the way to Damascus, which is only spiritual, and this, in a certain sense, set him apart from the physical actions or teaching of Christ, really doesn't make much sense. Since paradox involves seeming contradiction, which is actually based on truth, what is the truth that allows us to understand the seeming difference between the way Paul teaches us about Christ's life and what Christ teaches us? And the issue for most of these scholars has primarily been the issue of the Mosaic Law. And then I'm also going to talk about the truth that's at the source of the paradoxes about those who are married should act as though they're not, etc., after I do this, because actually the answer to the one relates to the other, and hopefully I'm going to apply this to religious life at the end. First of all, the answer lies in one of his great insights as a Pharisee and a practicing Jew into the nature of something I've already discussed for you in the first conference, which is justifying, sanctifying grace. The problem of the place of the Jewish law in relationship to grace is central to the mission and thought of St. Paul. Jesus had said he did not come to abrogate the law and the prophets, but to bring them to perfection. This statement is one of those which has caused the idea among scholars that Paul founded a new religion, which wasn't the religion of Jesus. In fact, one must interpret this statement in light of a later one that Christ makes in the Sermon on the Mount, the same place, where he says, unless your justice exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. St. Paul wished to explain that only Christ can justify, and to place the law in its proper position as a preparation for Christ, and then to try to show how the old law relates to what he calls in his letters the new law of the Spirit. In the thought of St. Paul, there are three basic epochs in the religious life of the world. There is the time of Abraham to the coming of Moses. Abraham, who was in a sense the founder of the people Israel, and the most important hero and holy one of the Old Testament. During this time, man could be justified by faith in the future Messiah, without any written law to guide him. You remember that the sign of Abraham's devotion to the future Messiah was circumcision. But at the time, Israel was not a constituted community. It was not yet in the fullest sense of the word a people of God, and there had been no written law imparted to them to make them this way. In a certain sense, you could say a person was justified. The old classic expression in the Latin terms is ex opere operantis, from the work of the worker, not by circumcision, but because circumcision was a sign of faith in the one who would eventually come to bring grace back to the human race. The second was the period from Moses to Christ. Again, justification in this time came through faith in the future Messiah, as far as it was possible for the people of Israel to know him. This faith included the obligation to live according to the law given on Mount Sinai, but also all the prescriptions that were added to that law in the Torah, in the Pentateuch. You remember, in the law on Mount Sinai, there were two, what we call tables. The first, because there were two tablets of stone. The first table comprised commandment of 1 to 3, and the second was commandment of 4 to 10. The first table has to do with those things which had to do with our worship of God and constituted Israel as a holy community. When Jesus comes to address the issues of this law, which is the ceremonial law, he explains to them that the interpretation of this law has to be more allegorical than spiritual, than literal. In other words, the issue isn't the literal observance of the Sabbath or the literal observance of all the prescriptions of the sacrifices, but what those things point to in regard to their spiritual dimension. In fact, the sacrifices will be completed in his own sacrifice, and the promise of circumcision, with its evident symbolism of overcoming lust and concupiscence, will be completed in the grace of Christ. And remember, it was by circumcision that a person became a member of this holy community, and they also had rituals of ordination to make people priests in this holy community. On the contrary, the second table of the law, which has to do with our relations with our neighbor, is more literal than allegorical. You remember the Pharisees kept trying to use, remember the Korban, the famous issue of the Korban, where they used this allegorical issue to do away with the literal sense of having to support their parents. And in Deuteronomy, you'll find many interesting prescriptions about the second table of the law that are very specific to Israel, like the law of first fruits. You remember, this is an attempt to show that profit isn't the only motive that should motivate a holy person when it comes to possessions and business, because the people are allowed to take, the owner of the field, the first harvest, but he has to leave the leavings for the poor, the blind, the widows, the orphans, etc., etc. Or you have that famous prescription about the coat. If you take your neighbor's coat as a pledge on a loan, you have to return it to him overnight because it may be the only thing which he has to cover his body. In other words, the Lord was trying to give them specific, literal prescriptions by which they could try to understand what it was like to live as a holy person. You remember the origin of the complaint of many of the prophets was that Israel pays service to God with their lips, but their deeds and their hearts are far from Him. So these two experiences of the Old Testament gave way to a third experience, which has to do with the living of the law itself. And this is since the time of Christ to, of course, the second coming, the time we live in today. Here one is justified by faith too, which is the beginning of our justification. Remember, St. Paul says by faith in Romans, Luther added only. Not only, please. The beginning of our justification is faith, but its completion has to involve deeds or works as preparatory to experiencing the grace of the Holy Spirit and as carrying out this Spirit. In other words, the religion of Christ is much more than an improved version of Judaism. The new law of Christ actually makes up for what was imperfect in the Mosaic law. St. Paul says the law brings death. Now why? Is there anything bad about the law? No. Those of you who say the office know, you have all those Psalms where every single verse includes the word, some word for the word law. The law of the Lord is perfect. It revives the soul. The commands of the Lord are clear. They give light to the eyes. The fear of the Lord is holy, enduring forever. The precepts of the Lord are just. And you can go on and on and on in these commandments. No, the law wasn't the cause of death in the sense that it brought about spiritual death because it was evil. It was the cause of death as an occasion of death because it taught a doctrine that could only be lived by grace and charity. But in itself, the practices of the Old Testament did not bring this grace and charity because Christ had not yet come. As a result, St. Paul clearly emphasizes, as a good Jew, the transitory and incomplete character of the old law in the epistle to the Ephesians. He now affirms its divine origin. He actually says in Galatians, the law was promulgated by angels and given to Moses. Still, adherence to the law could not bring divine life to the soul. In fact, as he teaches in Galatians, Abraham was justified apart from the law. And remember, justification involves not just the forgiveness of sins, that's what the Lutherans think, but it also involves in us this character of quality, the presence of the sanctification renewal of the interior man, by elevating us to experience communion with the life of the Trinity. This justice, which St. Paul calls righteousness, is not the virtue of justice brought about by giving rights to another, but what Christ referred to when in the upper room he said, "Peace be with you," and breathed on the apostles. In other words, it is the right state of soul in which all the powers of our soul, our bodies, our passions, our intellect, and our will are all one because they are all united and pointed to God. A right state of soul which can only be caused by God Himself healing us from our moral weakness. And you know, though each of us have experienced this healing through sanctifying grace, we still experience the effects of original sin in us. We still experience the fact that we are a rebellious city within. And Paul reflects this in the Romans by saying, I find it to be a law that when I want to do right, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, and making me captive of sin, which dwells in my members. Wretched man am I, who will deliver me from this body of death? So, the law of the Old Testament was given to the Jews to prepare a people of God from which a Messiah would come. It had as its purpose the renewal of mankind in the life of the Spirit. And of course it was promised in basis in the famous text of Genesis 3:15. When God says to the serpent, I'll put enmity between your seed and the woman, seed, he shall bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. The primary commandment of this law was, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one God. And it was given to found this people from whom the Messiah would come, and therefore to identify the Creator of the world with the Father of Jesus Christ. The people were blessed to receive the law, but like us, although we in a different way, They continually showed the law of the members by falling away from it. You remember when the law was handed over on Mount Sinai, what were the Israelites doing at the bottom of the mountain? They were breaking the first and most important of the commandments. They were worshiping idols. And all throughout their history, though they were a people of the law, they continued to practice religious syncretism. Or they continued to do as the prophets say, be unjust to their fellow members. And when the prophets tried to call them back to the right intention and observance of the law, well, they killed them. They wouldn't listen. Jesus himself calls attention to this inner nature of the law in the Sermon on the Mount. You recall that after he speaks the Beatitudes, which is the context of the giving of the new law, remember, Moses ascends the mountain, receives the tablets of stone. Jesus ascends the mountain, sits in the place of the lawgiver, and from his mouth speaks the New Testament, the Beatitudes, with the rewards given and things like that. Then Jesus talks about the old law. You have heard it said, blump. But I say to you, blump. Jesus doesn't abrogate the physical prescriptions of the Old Testament. What he does is give them their proper spiritual meaning. So, for example, with adultery, he redefines the commandment from forbidding sexual acts